We have Father Anthony Cekada, known arch sedevacantist, with us to talk a little bit about this forbidden subject. And when I say forbidden, it's because among traditionalist circles, when I say traditionalist, I am casting a very big tent. Among traditionalist circles, there are two things that are known. One is that we all like the Latin Mass, and two, sedevacantism is out of the question. Those are the only two things that we know.
Okay.
And so, as someone who, I suppose at some point in your past, we don't know when it was, these misty pasts, you were not a sedevacantist. You were part of the institutional Catholic Church, you recognized someone as Pope. So, there are a lot of articles you've written, in fact, a lot of articles you've written, Father, over the years about this issue. But the key question is, that I think informs this and helps us start our discussion, is how did you get there? How did you, because one of the things you told me that resonates with me a lot is, especially when you and I first started talking, which was a few years ago, these things take time to understand, to study, to digest, to pray about. How did you get there? How did this become clear for you?
I started out as what I suppose we would call nowadays a neocon or Novus Ordo conservative, a wander type of conservative. So I was growing up, I grew up before Vatican II, and I ended up in the minor seminary just as the Vatican II changes were being implemented. And it was slow, it was bit by bit. Our seminary high school was somewhat conservative, and we still had a lot of the old academic formation, but the Vatican II changes were just starting to be introduced. And you started to hear about all of these terrible things that were going on, different doctrines that priests were denying. And so this is in the 60s and maybe 65 to 69. All sorts of terrible things that were being done with the sacred liturgy. You saw the priests leaving the priesthood in droves. So there was all this ferment going on, and I came down all the time on the conservative side of things. And I said that, well, if we only stick with the Holy Father, surely everything is going to come out all right. And, if the Holy Father only knew about this, if he only knew about that, he would surely do something. So that was my mentality in the seminary high school. And as I expressed in other contexts to you, I was particularly disappointed when the new Mass came out, because it seems to institutionalize some of the things that I'd regarded as abuses. But, we defended the Holy Father, Paul VI. That's what we're very good at. Little pretzel-like yoga, I guess. But I did that through a high school, and I certainly did it through the seminary college. I put a lot of time into that and trying to promote the idea that if we're only loyal to Rome and we're only loyal to Paul VI, everything is going to work out. After college, seminary college was a terrible experience from the point of view of theology that we were taught. It was totally modernist. I went into the Cistercian order, which is a monastic order that was very conservative. And we were as conservative liturgically as you could get. The liturgy that we had was the new Mass. It was all in Latin, though. Everything was chant. We chanted the divine office, all the hours of the divine office, and so on. And there, too, I cultivated the idea very much, if we only stick with the Pope, everything is going to come out all right. The order sent me to Switzerland and to another conservative monastery. And this monastery had even more chant and even more ceremony than we had. We were supposed to be sent to the University of Freiburg in Switzerland to study, because supposedly it was more conservative. That was one of the initial reasons, by the way, that Archbishop Lefebvre selected Freiburg as the first seat of the Society of St. Pius X.
The least bad.
Yes, the least bad of the universities. But there, too, even among these young monks who were living this extremely conservative liturgical life, you still could see the influence of modernism, very much the influence of modernism. At that point, too, as well, Archbishop Lefebvre was very much in the news in France and in Switzerland. And there's a conflict between him and Paul VI. And a lot of the things that he said made a great deal of sense to me. That finally, after all these years, I was starting to see in my own very conservative context that the new Mass was pretty much indefensible, even in Latin. We had communion in the hand in the midst of all this magnificent chant. And the monks very much imbibed, especially the younger monks, these ideas. So at that point, I I left the Cistercians and I went to a Côme. And I came to the conclusion very quickly there that after all I had gone through, the problem with Vatican II, with its new disciplines and worship and new theological systems, was not a question of interpretation, but in fact it was the whole shooting match. It was everything. So at that point, it was everything that I had been defending and trying to put a conservative spin on. So the question is, well, how do you figure this out?
Did you have a particular tolle and lege moment where, I read something and it all clicked, or was it just a sort of gradual, because you're talking about reading some of the things that the Archbishop said. Mm-hmm. Was there something particular you read, or it just sort of gradually occurred to you, this is wrong?
Well, what kind of pushed me over the edge, as it were, about the new Mass, and then everything else sort of followed, was in the chapter every day, the abbot, who was a noted liturgist in the order and a very devout man, gave a sermon condemning what the Archbishop Lefebvre had been saying about the new Mass and the changes in the Church. And the example that he used for our attitude was taken from a book by Brian Moore called Catholics. It was a very popular book, and in fact was made into, I think, a movie.
Is
or
this with Martin Sheen?
Possibly.
I think I've heard
it was a
about this.
long time ago. So the idea behind Catholics was that Vatican III has happened, the bishops have come with their wives, and that there's this retro monastery.
And they're trying to force it.
They're trying to force something on them. At the end of the novel, the visitor from the Vatican forces, in effect, this new religion on the monks of the monastery. And one of the characters says something like this, that, well, even if I was told out of obedience, not to believe in God, I would still have to do that out of obedience. So Father Abbot was defending essentially this idea in the chapter. And I had an argument with him at night at recreation. I said, that's verrückt, that's crazy. How could you say something like that? It makes no sense. No, he was insisting that this was what one had to do, that obedience trumped everything. That
Which
in effect,
I suppose makes sense in a religious context, because, it's a particular vow. I mean,
sure.
But still.
But when it comes to it's in the context of the faith. So that really, that was a tolle lege moment. That pushed me over the edge. I couldn't believe that I'd gotten to this point and that this was happening. And so, I studied the different issues that had come, and of course the question is always authority. What about the question of the Pope? You have a council, you have a Pope who approve all these changes. From a doctrinal point of view, there are many things that seem to contradict or undermine what went on before. From the point of view of Catholic worship, you have this form of worship that admits of all sorts of sacrileges. If they're guaranteed by the authority of the church, how can this be? And that in turn got me thinking about the question of the Pope.
And is this before you're at a cone or while you're at a cone?
This is shortly before I get there. Because the question is, well, we're going to a place that the Pope condemns. What do you think about it? How should you put this into context? What's the explanation? What's an explanation for it that's consonant with Catholic doctrine? So you had at a cone in those days, we had all sorts of ideas and opinions on this particular question. And there were some who, in fact, said that no, in fact, Paul VI was that he was a heretic, and he could not be the Pope because he was a heretic.
And this was seminarians and professors?
Yeah. And this was a permitted thought. This is not a thought crime at that particular point.
There wasn't crime stop happening?
No, they weren't whistling you over during recreation. The term sedevacantism actually didn't exist. That was, I think, only came to be used in the 1980s. But you had people who adhered to this among the English-speaking and among the Germans. Father Schmidberger, in fact, had at one point as a seminarian. Yes, put out a pamphlet to this effect. So this was sort of ferment. And this made sense to me, an awful lot of sense to me, because clearly the changes were evil. Evil can't come from the authority of the church. Therefore, somehow, these people must not have authority in the church. And many of the things that Archbishop Lefebvre would say could lead you.
Father. You have to free yourself from these scholastic.
Well, I know these scholastic principles.
You set up, a major premise, minor premise, and you draw a conclusion from that. I don't know that that's really the way.
You have to stay off the premises, I think, is what you're saying. This was in the air. It was talked about. And, I'm not saying that the Archbishop certainly was a sedevacantist. He went back and forth in terms of what he said.
He permitted it to be talked about, and he permitted seminary professors to hold positions.
Oh, yeah, sure. And it was, obviously there was conflict among the professors about it, because some wanted the idea, or had the idea that, well, you couldn't say something like that at that point. So there was ferment all the time, and ferment and bubbling in the 70s. So I was there 75 to 77, and there was a lot of talk about that precisely because of his conflicts with Paul VI. So you had all sorts of different dramas going on.
So before you came to the seminary, it had sort of resolved itself for you that this made sense, that the reason why none of these things, all these things were bad, was because they didn't proceed from the authority of the church.
Yeah, how could the church give you the great sacrileges of Mass, for instance? How could that be possible?
I prefer the formulation of Archbishop Lefebvre at the Mass of Luther.
Or the Mass of Luther, for that matter. How could it do that? So it's the question, you come to the question of authority, and you come to the question of the church. You end up in a position where otherwise the church is kind of defecting. So you have to find a way around that central issue with regard to Vatican II and with regard to the different changes that came along with it.
And I think the way you've talked about it, Father, it makes a lot of sense as to how you resolved this for yourself. And as I said, you've written lots of articles. There isn't one comprehensive article. The closest I can think of is an article you wrote for The Remnant back in 2005, which was called Resisting the Pope, Sedevacantism, and Frankenchurch. And you state two premises for the beginning of your argument. The first is that the new Mass is evil and harmful to the faith. Now, while I wouldn't say that all traditionalists would articulate it in that way, they really do feel that.
Sure.
I may not say it's evil, that they'll shy away and want to have a semantic discussion about what evil means, but They won't go to the new Mass. They discourage people from going to the new Mass, and they think going to the new Mass is, if not sinful, certainly an occasion of scandal. The second point that you make is that the teachings of Vatican II and the Post-Vatican II hierarchy often contradict pre-Vatican II teachings and at least fall under the heading of doctrinal error.
Yeah.
Again, while a traditionalist may not formulate this tight, limiting phrase...
That's because Walter Matt limited me to 3,000 words. So that concentrates the mind.
That's true, but they would agree with you. So I grant these two general points as a starting place, and I think it's a reasonable place to start. There's not too much baggage there. New Mass equals bad, Vatican II equals bad.
Yeah.
From there, you proceed along the lines of what you're talking about how the church can't give a stone when someone asks for bread. Mm-hmm. That the idea of the church can only give you, what is necessary for salvation. I think over the years, as you've dealt with the same old reheated, microwaved leftovers of arguments, people continue to pick up the same objections and treat them as if this is the causa finita est part of the arguments. Well, I mean, Vatican II is a pastoral council. Therefore, there's nothing doctrinal there, so you don't have to worry about the whole heretical thing. This is their get-out-of-jail-free card. The Peter resisting...
Paul.
Peter resisting... That's the...
Or Paul resisting Peter, yes.
That is the quote, or Roma locuta est, causa finita est, or the prima sedes...
Nemine judicator, yeah.
These are all... They've been microwaved, they've been brought out. Well, this will clearly defeat Father Cekada's arguments. So the phrase that I find so fascinating, that I think first captured the sedevacantist argument for me, even when I was, I shall say, resisting the idea myself. I recognized the idea and resisted it. Your phrase recognize and resist, and Bishop Dolan has said this before, the have your pope and eat him too argument, I think is very attractive.
Of course.
I get to be a good Catholic, which is what you articulated in the conservative position. Well, let's just go with the Holy Father, and Holy Father this, and Holy Father that, and yes, Holy... Because that's bred into you as a good Catholic. It was bred into me.
Sure was bred into me, yeah.
So it allows you to act that out via pictures in your vestibule and mention in the canon and referring to him in conversation. He exists. Yes. But it also allows you to say, but all of these things are bad. And I think what's hard for most traditionalists to realize is recognize and resist is not a Catholic position. It's not defensible as a Catholic position. But it's the position many people have found themselves in because they haven't done enough work or thought about the implications of their position. It's easy to say the new Mass is bad because it's a visceral reaction.
Sure.
It's easy to say Vatican II makes no sense because you can see the contradictions side by side. But what's hard is to say, and now what? And I think recognize and resist is the necessary holding place where those of us have to stop, potentially. And I suppose was summarized in your summer before your entry, where you're trying to figure this out. And this is extended for most people, or it's Crime Stop. I'm not allowed to think about it, not only because Bishop Fillet says I'm not allowed to think about it, but because that means the gates of hell have prevailed, etc. All of these drastic things. Yet they're in this holding position. So recognize and resist is an attractive position. And you go through and you talk about various things explaining why recognize and resist can't work. What do you think is perhaps the most compelling argument for why recognize and resist cannot be accepted as a Catholic response or a Catholic position?
Submission to the Roman Pontiff. It's necessary for salvation to be submitted to the Roman Pontiff, not just in word, but in deed as well. And that's the underlying idea because of the connection of the Roman Pontiff with the identity of the Catholic Church.
Well, but they do recognize him. They mention him in the canon. They pray for him at benediction. They've got a nice picture of him. He's wearing this white cassock. I mean, they do recognize him.
Yes, it's great. My favorite German Shepherd, but he's a pet German Shepherd, right? There's no actual submission to him in terms of how, let us say, one conducts one's apostolate as a priest who follows this position. You're not submitted to those who are submitted to him. And this is completely out of the way of normal things, how that is supposed to be for a Catholic.
But we're allowed to resist him because that's what
Peter did to Paul and everything. But the idea there, what they are in fact resisting the Roman Pontiff in, or Vatican II in, is what is in effect the universal ordinary magisterium of the Church, which they have to accept as infallible. The people in this position reject many of the teachings in the New Catechism, let us say. But a teaching that is in the Catechism is considered part of the universal ordinary magisterium. It's taught everywhere by the Pope and the bishops. So the question is, if you're in the recognize and resist camp, how do you get out of that? And
well, you're just
the
following
answer
tradition.
is,
that's what you're doing. You're following
yes,
tradition.
you're just following tradition, which is their fallback. But in terms of Catholic theology and an understanding of the nature of the Church, it never addresses the issue. How can the Church give you error? How can the Church give you something that contradicts what was said before? So you end up with these vague formulations of, well, we're following tradition, the Pope is like a bad father to us, who's giving us these evil commands. We take care of that, I think, in this article as well. That's you have to stop and think, but it's a fatuous analogy, because your father has dominative power over you, and he is always your father, and always continues to be your father. Whereas the Pope has jurisdiction over you, which is something completely different. He can make laws, and it is a public power that is given for the good of the Church. So you have these different false and fatuous analogies that the recognize and resist crowd engages in. And those, ultimately, when you look at them closely, really do not fly. Or, for instance, the idea of resisting commands. The Pope gives you an evil command. And that's completely different from the question of a law, which is an act of public jurisdiction. There's nothing that prevents the Pope from giving someone an evil command. I think I give the example in there of Dynamite Fatima, bring me another blonde chorus girl, Monsignor. The thing is, that's an evil command. That's not a law. So these arguments simply don't hold water. There has to be another explanation for it.
Well, but who are you to judge, Father? I think
that's always the next thing.
Yeah, I mean, who are you? I mean, we can't. The first see is judged by nobody. Ergo, you can't judge anybody, and the Pope's the highest authority. Therefore, perhaps, let me just grant, Father, that you might be right.
Yes, okay.
But we're not going to know till the future. It's like how the Great Western Schism was resolved. Those people didn't know how to act. They didn't know who was the Pope. They had to wait for the future in order to find out if they were right.
And so the question is, what do I have to do now, though? If a submission to the Roman Pontiff is a matter for salvation. So what do I have to do now? How do I have to act? And that, in fact, is the question. How do I reconcile this?
The luxury of the Great Western Schism was you had three guys to pick from.
Yes, at least. So you could say that, well, to whichever one works.
But in your situation, you would say you're submitting to nobody.
Say again?
You would, in your position, you would be submitting to nobody because you don't recognize.
If there were one there, we would submit to him. But the question, you could have the vacancy of the apostolic see that can go on for a long time, and people still get to heaven during that particular period of time. So even though there's not someone visible who is the visible head of the church on earth, you be submitted to him if there were someone who's visible.
They would answer that we've had, interregnums as far as, 3 or 4 years, but 40 years, Father. I mean, that's a bit unreasonable. God has time on his hands.
So the thing is, the answer to that is, has some theologian dealt with the issue? And you find that, yes, if you look into the question of ecclesiology, you find that there are some theologians who say that, yes, in fact, the church can exist without a pope, without a head on earth for a very long time. And the state of the church on earth during that period of time is a state of, in effect, like a body without a head, that functions of the church are obviously slowed down. There are certain things that cannot be done anymore because the church lacks a head on earth. But nevertheless, the church continues to exist because her head is in heaven, even though his representative is not on earth.
Do you have a particular work or citation for that?
Yeah, I think it's Cajetan is one of the ones. There's one of the theologians in the back of the other pamphlet that I wrote on this question speaks about that specifically. It may be someone like de Groot, a standard heavy-duty, though, Dominican theologian writing about ecclesiology. So it boils down, your issue, how you answer the authority, or the question of the Pope, boils down to a question of ecclesiology, right? That the church can exist without Pope for a while, but the church can't give you error. The church can't give you an evil mass.
And I think that's the fundamental quandary that those who are in the recognize and resist camp find themselves in, is they do agree with you, whether or not they want to, about the new Mass and about Vatican II, but they can't go where you go. And why do you think that is, Father? Why do you think it's such a verboten subject? Why is the conclusion, or at least even the possibility, which Archbishop Lefebvre on numerous times said that it was a theological possibility, why can that not even be discussed?
Well, that's a good question, because people are terrified of the consequences, looking, as it were, over into the abyss.
In the abyss.
And it becomes then extremely controversial. That, for instance, if Lefebvre had said that would have a good number of people simply would have left him. I know that when he made statements that seem to come very close to sedevacantism, there's a total uproar.
They would have said, this is a hard saying.
And this is a hard saying, and goodbye, yeah. And it's so difficult and so counterintuitive, because on the other hand, you have the whole media against you portraying, say, JP2 as the big conservative, or Benedict XVI as the big guy who is conservative, who is even more conservative and traditional. He's going to overturn Vatican II. So it goes against all of this, but it's the once you make a judgment on, say, the new way of worship, and you say that it's evil, it's harms souls, there's something theologically bad about it, and once you make the judgment upon the official teachings of Vatican II and those who interpret it as containing error, which most trads have done historically, you're also making a judgment on authority. Because when you say that, you're saying implicitly it can't come from authority. It can't come from the authority of the church, because the authority of the church can't give you that. Otherwise, the church defects and is fallible. This is the question of sedevacantism is based on a notion that has a foundation in theology, that someone loses the faith, someone can lose the faith, because both baptism and faith are necessary to be members of the church. When he becomes a public heretic, that loss of faith becomes manifest in public, he puts himself outside the church. If he's in a position of authority, he puts himself outside of that position of authority as well. That is possible. The canonist theologians tell you that. And you have two popes who admit that that's possible. Paul IV and his bull Cum Ex Postulatus, whatever you may think about its validity now, and Innocent III. And they say the Pope is already judged who falls into heresy. So that is a tenable position in terms of canon law, papal teaching, etc., and dogmatic theology. What is not a tenable position is the idea that the authority of the Catholic Church gives you evil and gives you some species of error.
I think that's interesting. You go back to Vatican II, because I think a lot of people would be intimidated by the notion that they'd have to read Benedict XVI, that they'd have to read, if they could even do it. I mean, it's just such tough slogging when you get through it. But that they would have to read it and then make some sort of judgment as a private layman. But you're pointing out that they're already making that judgment by refusing to go to the new Mass and by refusing the teachings of Vatican II.
Sure. So just by refusing the new catechism. If you are in the recognize and resist camp somewhere, well, if the priest comes in and says, we're going to use the John Paul II catechism, there'd be an uproar. And you say, no, it contains error. You know, it's all that ecumenism and religious liberty and all those funny ideas about the church. We can't teach our kids that. You know, little Marcel, I mean, we have to cover his ears, you know. But you've already made the judgment. And I tell people that once you start with those two ideas, that there is the new Mass is evil and harmful to souls, and that the official Vatican II and Post-Vatican II teaching contains error, you're already become a sedevacantist. It's just that you don't know it yet.
I think you make that point at the end of it. At the end of the last line of your article says, all traditionalists, therefore, are really sedevacantists. It's just that they haven't figured it out yet. And I think that that's the reality of the recognize and resist camp. And that's part of why it's a transition from the indult to recognize and resist to sedevacant, because it's a gradual realization of where this leads me.
Sure.
But that's ultimately what's going on, is a recognition of the consequences of what this means when I make this judgment. Because when you're in the conservative camp, you don't make that judgment. It's just,
no, you don't. You say
Vatican II must be good because the Holy Father said it, and then you have a pretzel sandwich. But by the time you get there into the recognize and resist camp, people just, I think, you've alluded to it before, the abyss. It's just, I don't want to, the modern, very modern saying, I don't want to go there. I have
people don't. Yeah, they're comfortable.
I have my Latin Mass. I've got a school for my kids to go to. We've got devotions on Thursday night. Father does catechism class. We can talk about this. Why are you trying to stir trouble? I don't want to go back to garage masses. I don't want to be driving Father, on his mass circuit. We're happy. And while that may sound fairly callous, I do feel that summarizes the position of most recognized and resistors. They just don't want to talk about it. Or they'll just send me to an article, the one or two articles that have resolved this issue for them. Mm-hmm. So here, read this article and this will fix it for you. Because this issue is not about one article. This issue is not going to be resolved by, even, as I said, I think that your Frankenchurch article is a good article. I think it's a start. I think for those who really want, they're going to have to do the hard work, which most people aren't willing to do, which you alluded to about Cajetan, which is you're going to have to go look it up.
Yes, precisely.
And most people just aren't willing to do it. They want to be told, and they don't realize this is exactly what happened and how we got into this mess in the first place, is because they just did whatever Father told them. Father told them this was a transitional rite. Father told him that this was sanctioned by the Vatican. I've got mimeograph sheets that we're using for the missal, but Father said it was fine. But they're just repeating it. So they're talking about how, oh, the 60s were so bad, and we just went along with whatever Father said. But now, Father writes an article against it. That means that that's it. I don't need to talk about it anymore.
Yes.
When it's been foreseen by theologians in the church that this could happen.
Precisely.
It's even been seen by a pope, but they don't want to read it, or if they do, it says, well, I read an article about it, therefore you're wrong.
Yes.
It doesn't even seem like you could bring the specter of, the Archbishop and say, well, the Archbishop said it was a possibility. Well, that was in his time. But now...
That was then, this is now. Yeah.
And that brings us to, where we are now, which is... Well, let me pause on that. The question then is begged, Father, let's grant that you're right. Now where are we? What do we do now? Don't we have a conclave? Don't we elect a new pope?
Well, we wouldn't have the authority to do that.
But you have the authority to judge who's the pope.
Well, how that works, though, is actually we don't. You have to understand what you mean about judge. You make an individual judgment of whether or not something is Catholic or not in the case of the new Mass. That's not the same as a legal judgment. Legal judgment where you're sitting in the position of a judge, let us say in the ecclesiastical court. You don't have, all of that stuff is based on human law. And when it comes to the question of the Pope, it's clear from the teaching of Innocent III that he says the heretical Pope is already judged. So there's no need for anything like that, some sort of a judicial procedure. Where you do run into a problem in terms of church law and conclaves and exotic stuff like that is that it is very clear in church law that you cannot fill an office unless it is clear that you have the right to fill that office, and unless there's a declaration from someone in authority that the office is vacant. We can't do that. Right? We can't start the legal mechanism up to start a conclave.
Who would have that authority?
Well, the thing is that, at that point, I have to say that I don't know. The theologians have taken, in the 14 and 1500s, took the question of what would happen if there's an extinction of the College of Cardinals. Well, they say that the clergy of the city of Rome would have the authority to elect a head because he would be the head of the Roman Church. So they have thought about this. They've talked about this. Well, then the next question is, what if you didn't have the...
what if
they all died in a plague or something. Well, then the theologians say the church would then have the power to designate someone as her pastor. And then that's where they stop. Unfortunately.
Which dog or cat in Rome.
Yeah, so so I have to say that, from the point of view of procedure, I don't know. But the inability to figure out what the legal mechanism would be for attempting a pope.
So for you, it's a legal issue. It's not an issue. If you did discover, you say you don't know now, but if you did discover a legal mechanism that made sense in
yeah, there might be something like that. I think someone would have come up with it at this point. But you say that the fact that you can't figure out some sort of a legal mechanism or you can't predict the future doesn't mean that by default you can go back to a situation where the authority of the church exercised through the Roman pontiff can give you an evil right or contradictory teachings. So it's two separate issues. The inability to resolve the legal issue doesn't do anything. You have some saints who say that one day Pope will be designated from heaven by Saints Peter and Paul. That's one possibility people have talked about. So in addition to the General Council. So who knows? But that doesn't resolve the problem of authority the authority of the church giving you something evil. You get no contradiction. You end up in sedevacantism. You may end up in mystery as to what's going to happen in the future, but you don't end up in contradiction, where you get a defecting authority.
Well, and I think that's I often see in an article, article named like, sedevacantism a dead end, or, where have you taken us?
Yeah.
You've taken us to a dead end, and that's a sterile faith, and, the Catholicism's sterile, and that's where you're taking us. Or they'll argue from, a number standpoint, Sedevacans not very numerous, you don't have a lot of religious congregations, clearly there's not, by their fruits you shall know them, there's not a lot of you, therefore you're wrong. That's another way. So you're looking at effects, as you're saying.
Sure.
Rather than going back, the root issue is, can the church do this? Okay. If you can answer that question, then we get to play the what if.
Mm-hmm.
But since you can't answer that question, you can't really bring up this is a dead end, or we don't know where this goes, because you haven't answered the original question, which is recognize and resist the Catholic response to the current crisis? So you're willing to concede that the end of sedevacantism, or shall we say, the conclusion, leads you to sort of a mystery as to where we are in church history.
Who knows? And this is where the Great Western Schism analogy, though, does work. The people in that situation did not have an idea about how it was going to be resolved. And that's essentially what we have. But we know that it can't be a defecting church.
And I think what's fascinating about that situation as well is that the church didn't go back and define, well, this guy was pope from this time to this time.
Mm-hmm.
I think partly because they were just glad that the whole situation was over, but I think partly because you're back to your point about, well, what happens if all the priests die in Rome? Says, well, do we really need to go back that far? It's a sort of
they didn't
sort of dangerous territory here when we go back. So there are a couple sidebars here which I find interesting that I don't think they touch on the matter and the real heart of the problem, but they are an obsession among traditional Catholics.
Okay.
The first is that I would call them the hardcore Fatima people.
Mm-hmm.
Father can't be right because Our Lady said that Russia will be consecrated to the Immaculate Heart by the Pope, and that there will be a period of peace. Since consecration has not happened, and you have to have a pope to do the consecration, Father is trying to go against Our Lady, ergo Father is wrong.
Yes, that's a whole...
That's putting you against Our Lady.
Yeah, and you don't want to be against Our Lady, So there are a whole series of wrong propositions in there. The first is Fatima. It's private revelation. And you do not have to accept private revelation, and it's not correct data really for dealing with a question like this. And in fact, Archbishop Lefebvre himself said at a conference at Econ that it was a distraction. The whole Fatima issue was one big distraction away from the real battle, which is with modernism. That precisely because it is a private revelation that is subject to additional private interpretation by all sorts of different people. So it really doesn't work, from that point of view. So you have private revelation is, even as edifying as it is not really necessarily a starting point as to give you an underlying principle for some sort of theological argument. Then B, that is, you have people who are putting interpretation on top of this private revelation, in the sense that they're saying, well, it wasn't done, A, or B, it wasn't done properly, Pius XII or whoever didn't do it properly. And then from that they're going to the idea that, well, you have to have a pope to do this, therefore. So it's an argument that it's weak at every juncture. Well, that doesn't necessarily convince people like this because the primary datum is the Fatima message, and that was the Archbishop Lefebvre's point. And that's why it is this sort of argument is really a distraction.
Well, I suppose I want to put an asterisk or a footnote here, Father, because I would say that, would it be fair to say that you're someone who's personally edified by the message of Fatima, and you've probably given some about it?
Sure. And but you have to understand that where it fits into the big picture of Catholic theology.
You're not willing to take that, what happened at Fatima, and use it as part of a discussion about ecclesiology and the state of the church.
Yeah, you can't use that as a starting point, because you're going to run into as edifying as any private revelation is. That's even especially those that are approved by the authority of the church. It doesn't work that way in terms of resolving an issue of ecclesiology. You're not going to find a theologian who says, well, if you have a private revelation of this sort, you can use it as the data that you start to reason to a conclusion about authority in the church. So it's apples and oranges. It's completely beside the point.
The other is the notion of where this begins, and I think we had a conversation some years ago about, you had said the Declaration on Religious Liberty was sort of a particular point, a data point you could look at and say, well, that could possibly...
Yeah, you say that it's the way I approach it is it's definitely by this point. Before that, it's a question, to discuss and argue about. But it's something definite at this point.
But I think I'm drawn back to your point originally that, it doesn't matter. I don't have to judge John Paul II or Paul VI or John the 23rd, because the original disputes with Vatican II, which both John the 23rd and Paul VI participated in. So that's this.
Sure, and we say that this and its official explication by these people is error. It's doctrinal error. And so you end up with error in the magisterium. And the magisterium of the church becomes inherently unreliable. And you have to protect yourself from the magisterium because it's giving you poison and it's giving you good things, and you have to go through and you have to sift it. And you have to find what's consistent. Yes, Father Schmittberger's. And criblé, I think, was the French word that he used. And you have to sift through it. And that's actually a good description of the procedure. That, you're panning for gold here, right? And you have someone, in addition to the magisterium, who's doing gold panning for you, and or you do that yourself in the comfort of your own study. And so what is dross and is worthless is disregarded, and then you're just picking up the gold.
Well, and I think that's the sort of horrifying notion to me when I started to realize what Recognize and Resist was really about. It was this Protestant notion of, I can interpret, how I feel works.
Yes.
As opposed to me, the logic of the canon of St. Vincent of Lerins, has this been something believed always, everywhere, by everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Semper ubique ab omnibus. If this is true, then that's what I can hold to. All this other stuff is at least questionable. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose sedevacantism is best characterized as a holding pattern. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of a frozen amber moment in time. We're waiting for further instructions. Radio communication has been lost.
That's right. To the mothership.
Yes.
I've always said that we're essentially in a holding pattern, maintaining as best we can Catholic doctrine and discipline and worship. And it's, in that sense, it's an emergency situation, and we have to try to keep this going. And we're not setting up our own hierarchy in the sense of people with jurisdiction or anything like that, but we're simply keeping going. And this is the best we can do. And you run into, of course, necessarily, because the jurisdiction and authority are the things that hold, the glue that hold the church together, because you have that absence of authority, then someone who is exercising authority, then necessarily you find disagreements among different groups. But that's been repeatedly the case in the history of the church, where the Pope could not exercise his authority, let's say, in one country, one particular country like England or France at a certain point. You had all of those difficulties and those divisions. So it flows from that, and you suffer from the lack of authority, real authority.
I told you that we would maybe title this conference, this interview, as after one of your old articles.
Yes.
And I think it was the Roman Catholic. It was from the
Actually, Sacerdoticium.
Sacerdoticium, but from the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us who go around reading old dusty tomes like that, but it was a Sedevacans on how to tell Aunt Helen, and I think that that's ultimately what I was trying to understand and have a conversation with you about today, which is, if I'm talking to somebody who's in the recognize and resist camp, what would you say is the one or two questions he or she should be asking him or herself about what it is that's going on? Let's say I'm a recognize and resistor, and I had a chance to speak with the evil Father Cekada.
Mm-hmm. Radioactive. Yeah, I think that's
and
another characterization.
Passing by and he whispered something terrible in my ear. What would those one or two questions be that you think will provoke, for those who are open-minded, because I don't think everyone's open-minded, and I don't think everyone's of goodwill, but for those who are of goodwill and those who are open-minded, what are those one or two questions you think would provoke the right path of looking things up?
Can the authority of the church give you error, and can the authority of the church give you evil? And when you start with that, if, as every Catholic is supposed to say, no, then the next question is, what about everything else? What about Vatican II? What about the new discipline, the new worship? It has to begin, I think, with those questions. Those are the ones to ask. And how can I reconcile the situation in the Post-Vatican II Church and what I think about it as a trad, that there's error and there's evil, with the notion of the indefectibility and the infallibility of the Church? And those two things go together. And the answer to that is no. You have to find a coherent explanation. If it's not, if the Church herself can fail, you have to remember that men can fail. When they're men of the Church in positions of authority, they lose their authority. And that is the only explanation that can be coherent in terms of Catholic theology.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Father.
My pleasure. Say hi to Aunt Helen for me.
I sure will.